is my new DMR 7x14 walnut solid shell 1-ply walnut snare drum. It's got 16 lugs on it, 8 on the top, 8 on the bottom, die cast hoops, and a Bennett R2 snare throw off. And Dan at DMR has done a beautiful job of making this drum, and it sounds awesome. And I'm going to take off my other DMR snare drum, my Hammer 6.5x14 cast aluminum snare drum, and I'm going to throw up the brand new DMR walnut just so you could get a feel for what it sounds like. And this is not mic'd, it's not processed, but it's kind of a middle tuning. So thanks, Dan. Thanks for a great snare drum.
Welcome to the story behind the gear, and today I'm going to talk to you about 2 snare drums I own, both made by DMR Custom Drums. Now, DMR Custom Drums is a independent custom drum company that started in the 2000s. In the early 2000s, there were a lot of custom drum companies. Today, there's still custom drum companies that are making drums. But there was like a real resurgence of a good old American drum making that started in the 2000s. And Dan Rottele, the owner of DMR Custom Drums, totally got into that concept and started building drums the way he wanted to build drums in the 2000s. Now, DMR stopped making drums probably around 2013, 14. But my association with Dan was when he lived down here in the West Palm Beach area, and I met him by an ad on Craigslist. And the ad on Craigslist read something like this: looking to trade vintage or custom drums for drum lessons. I thought, wow, that's an interesting one. And it was a 561 area code, so I knew it was West Palm Beach. And I called the number, and I got Dan on the phone, and I found out that Dan's factory at the time, which was this big warehouse about 5 minutes from here, was right down the road from me. And I said, hey, I'd love to talk to you about doing some drum lessons with you. When can we meet? He said, well, I'm down here, and we talked about location. Dan said, come on down. And this was lunchtime, and I happened to be home that week. So I got in my car, and 5 minutes later I was at Dan's, basically his little warehouse, where he was building drums, and he was buying drums and selling drums for eBay, him and his partner. And Dan's the person that I got my first Pearl fiberglass toms from, because he happened to have 4 Pearl concert toms plus an orphan 10-inch tom. And I bought all 5 of those drums. I actually traded him 2 Paiste cymbals for those 5 concert toms that are now part of that concert tom kit over there, off to my right. But Dan was in the buying and selling business of eBay at the time, and he was making a business of it, and he was building custom drums. And him and his partner actually had just come back from a trip to Taiwan, where they went to a factory where they make these Taiwanese drums. And they also make drums for Gretsch and DW and others. Paiste drums being the other one. And probably a couple other makers. They make hardware and drums, etc. So with that being said, I met Dan, and we sat down behind one of his kits, and he showed me what he could play, and I showed him what I could play. And then we started talking. And as we were talking, we walked into his workshop, and he had a snare drum shell on the table. And I said to him, with the snare drum shell, it was a cast aluminum snare drum shell that he brought back from Taiwan. And this was 2008. And Dan brought back this cast aluminum snare drum, 3 mils thick with 5 mil reinforcing rings, which really wasn't reinforcing rings, it was just cast that way. They look like reinforcing rings. And he had it on his workbench. And I said to him, how much? He goes, what can I trade you for lessons? And I looked over at that shell and I said, can you build me a snare drum? And with that, he said, yeah. I said, well, how many lessons is it going to take for me to get, that snare drum built? And at the time, I think the price of that snare drum was probably somewhere around $550. And I think I ended up doing lessons every week for like 3 months kind of thing. It's one of those things. I was charging like $50 a lesson. And I think it took me about 3 months for him to work it off. And what came out of it was this snare drum, my DMR cast aluminum snare drum. Now, the interesting thing about this snare drum is that besides it being this cast aluminum shell that he picked up at the Taiwan factory, by the way, these same cast aluminum shells were used on DW drums at the time, on Gretsch drums of the time, and Paiste drums of the time. So if you have a Paiste drum or a Gretsch shell or a DW shell that's cast aluminum 6.5 by 14, there's a possibility it was made in the same factory that this particular cast aluminum shell was built in. Now, what I saw was a raw aluminum shell. And I said to Dan, I want this drum built to my specifications. That was the key to this whole thing. So that began my association with DMR Custom Drums. And when he built this drum, another custom drum builder was very popular at the time. His name was Ron Dunnett. And Ron Dunnett made throw-offs, and he built snare drums. And some of Ron Dunnett's throw-offs and most of all of Ron Dunnett's snare drums at the time were signed by Ron Dunnett inside the drum. So when I started talking to Dan about building me this snare drum, there was a couple things I wanted that he never did before. Now, Dan's drums, and I'll try to throw in some pictures of some of Dan's drum kits. Dan, and I think today he's doing this, I think he paints cars and motorcycles today. Dan loved painting drums. He loved assembling drums. He was really good at doing bearing edges, and he's done some bearing edge work for me, and he's done a great job on the bearing edges. So Dan knew how to do bearing edges, but he didn't make the shells. He bought the hardware for the shells, and his style was that flamey kind of DW style. Like DW was putting flames on some of their drum kits, and it was kind of like what you saw on hot rods. So Dan had that hot rod painting style, and my style, of course, is more traditional wood. I consider it not the hot rod style, the rock and roll style paint job. Mine is more of a classic jazz drummer kind of style. This walnut Gretsch kit is a perfect example. I went from a Vista-like kit to this walnut Gretsch kit. After I played my rock and roll drum kit, when I went to college, I wanted to get a kit that would be respected when I took it on a gig. And the walnut Gretsch kit is an example of a drum kit that when you see it, it looks respectable. It looks like professional drums. And that's what I was going after. So all the snare drums I was going after were drums that had that look. So let me step it back to my journey to getting to a DMR custom snare drum. Back in 1987, when I was with the band Saved by Grace, we did a couple short tours after we did the record. And one of the tours took me up to upstate New York. And I met this guy, I don't remember his name, but I was playing a Slingerland chrome over wood snare drum at the time with this Gretsch kit. And the guy came up to me and goes, you need to get a Noble Cooley. Noble Coolies are the best snare drums. Now, this is before I became hip to snare drums. And to be honest, I still wasn't quite there. I knew about, super sensitive Ludwigs. I knew about Superphonics. I had this TDR Slingerland chrome over wood snare drum that sounded like terrible. Matter of fact, probably the worst sounding snare drum I've ever owned was that snare drum in retrospect. Never liked it. Never sounded the way I thought it should sound. But this guy said, you want a wood snare drum, you need to get a Noble Cooley. Well, a couple years later, my good friend Scott Hazen came over my house on my 30th birthday. And what did he have in his car? He just came back from a gig. He had his 7x14 Maple Noble Cooley, solid shell. And I used that drum for years because I had the drum for years. There was about 5 or 6 or 7 years I had that snare drum. And I loved solid shell snare drums. I loved 7-inch solid shell snare drums. Now, it's another story how I traded that back to my friend Scott. He got the drum again. Eventually, I got another Noble Cooley out of the deal with Scott. I went through a bunch of Noble Coolies. I had a 5x14 black lacquer Noble Cooley that my friend Pat gave me back in the 90s we traded for. I had the 7x14 for a while. Eventually, Scott found a Piccolo. And at one point, he found me one of those Alloy Classic drums, which I had for a while, a 5x14. And I liked the Alloy Classic, but I didn't like the rims on the Alloy Classic. So I had some issues with the rims on it. And eventually, he's the one who gave me the 5x14 Noble Cooley that I have today, which was part of a drum kit he had. And the Noble Cooley is a whole other story behind the gear. But it gives you the progression of where I end up going with DMR Custom Drums. So I see this shell, and it's this aluminum color of the lugs. And I thought it was the coolest thing, aluminum shell. I wanted to keep an aluminum shell. The problem was when Dan came back from Taiwan, he stuck it in his suitcase, and there were some scratches on it. So as we got closer to the build of the drum, Dan's going, we really should powder coat your drum. And I'm going, no, man, just clear coat it, and it'll be fine. I don't care if there's a couple scratches. No, I want to do the right thing for you. Dan was that kind of guy. He is that kind of guy. I haven't talked to him in a few years, but he's still that kind of guy. He wants to do the right thing for you. So Dan said, no, let's look at powder coating the drum. So what we did, we found a powder coater in town, and we had this drum powder coated, this rough matte black powder coating, because I always thought black was a classy looking drum. The other thing I wanted on this snare drum, I wanted die cast hoops. So we went 10 lugs, die cast hoops, and I wanted a Dunnett throw off like the Dunnett snare drums. Now at the time, there was the Dunnett R1, which is actually on this snare drum is a Dunnett R1. I'll get into this one in a second. This is the DMR 7x14 walnut drum. We'll get into in a second. But this drum, Dan actually called Ron Dunnett up, and Ron Dunnett sent him a R2, which had the curved like this. This is an R4, by the way. Why do I have an R4 on this drum when I had an R2? That's an unfortunate mistake on my part, because one day I had it laying on the floor with this hanging off, and I caught my foot on it, and I broke the R2 snare strainer. I still have it around here somewhere, but it's broken. There's a little plastic piece that broke. Anyhow, long and short of it, I had to go buy myself an R4 replacement, and I did. It fit perfectly, and you can't really tell the difference. But for me, I had an R2 when I bought this drum. So Dan put die-cast hoops on it. He put on this 25-strand strainer, even though I wanted a 42. I even tried a 42 on it. This worked the best. And he did the other thing I asked him to do, which was to sign the drum. And because he knew my nickname was The Hammer, he wrote in it The Hammer 001, and he signed Dan Rottele in the shell. So I'm kind of documenting this for my grandkids and for somebody else who might get this drum someday if my grandkids dump it. Hopefully they never sell this drum, but I can't guarantee that once I'm gone. But this drum is number one. It's got The Hammer in it, written on it. We called this drum The Hammer, by the way. And he built a couple more of these snare drums. He got a couple more shells, and he sold them. One person who has one of these drums doesn't look as classy as mine, by the way, because Dan amped it up for the particular artist drummer. But Rich Redmond, believe it or not, Rich Redmond of Jason Aldean fame, Dan Rottele gave him a DMR custom snare drum that was a cast aluminum. It had red lugs on it and red hardware. Like I said, Dan and I have different ideas of what classy is. And he gave it to Rich Redmond. And I don't know if Rich Redmond has that drum or has used that drum. That I'm not sure of. But it's a cast aluminum. And it's just like mine. Same shell. By the way, I've had people tell me this drum sounds incredible. This is like a Superphonic on steroids, to be honest, because it's cast aluminum. If you've ever played a Gretsch cast aluminum, a lot of guys do, you'll know what I'm talking about. It has the same sound. It's got a distinct presence. It definitely sits in the mix a certain way, and it is a beautiful snare drum. So the DMR cast aluminum snare drum that I've had was the first one. And I've had this for a long time now, and I guess I got it in 2008, so I've had it a long time. It's getting close to 15 years. I still play it, not as much as I used to, but I still play it, and I love the drum. That started my association with Dan at DMR Custom Drums. Now, there's a second drum, and the second drum is this DMR Walnut snare drum. And this is what inspired me to do this show today. I posted a picture of this little Gretsch kit next to me, and it's over here off camera. And I had this snare drum sitting on it, and this particular snare drum is a 7x14 walnut, solid walnut shell. Now, the shell was built by Vaughn Craft Percussion, and Vaughn Craft Percussion was building solid shell drums, solid shells for custom drum builders, and some tambourines and things, wood blocks and all kinds of strange stuff. Vaughn Craft, I believe, is out of business now, and probably for a good reason. This snare drum, which has been called the Duke by Dan named this drum for me. He called me the Duke Earl. It actually says the Duke in it. It's got his stamp in it. He got into stamping his drums. He changed his logo a little bit. This was his logo badge. He used to burn it into the drums and then paint over it, on a paint thing. But he built a custom badge for me. That's another story. But he actually put in his name and signed it and called it the Duke and stamped it on the shell. But this is not the first drum he built for me. I commissioned him to build the drum. I paid him for this drum. As an endorser, I got an endorser price, I guess. But I paid him to build this drum. So as he was building the drum, we had this wild-looking paint scheme. I'm going to show you some pictures of the paint scheme of the other drum. And after he got to the point where he got the drum with hardware on it, which, by the way, is the same hardware that's on this drum because it is replicas of a Radio King. Now, let's talk about solid shell drums. When you talk about solid shell one-ply drums, Radio King is the inventor. In everybody's book, a Radio King snare drum from the 30s is an original solid shell snare drum. One-ply steam bent reinforcing rings, maple. So that's what I was going for. I wanted a maple shell. I wanted it to be kind of a bird's eye maple. I wanted the flame of the bird's eye to come through the shell, and I wanted a cool paint job on it. And I had picked the color. I saw the pictures before I came here to talk about it. I can't believe that was the color I picked because it really didn't match my drum kit, but I picked this crazy color. He got this color scheme thing going for me. He painted the drum. He started putting it together, and as he did, he realized the shell was out of round. Now, Vaughn Craft Percussion had a problem with shells being in the round. So he got all the way to building this drum shell, and he said, I can't give this to you. He said, it's out of round, and you're not going to be happy with it. It's not going to tune properly. And Dan, being the kind of guy he was, he called the guy at Vaughn Craft Percussion, and he had a walnut shell. And he sent Dan the walnut shells. And when Dan got the walnut shell, I said to Dan, listen, what I really wanted in these lugs was something that looked classy like a Radio King snare drum. So I had him build me this walnut, 7x14 walnut drum, which is walnut shell, one ply, walnut reinforcing hoops, okay? By the way, this is the beginning of the Funky Woods that they started building snare drums with, like tulip wood today and cherry, and they were already building drums with mahogany, but walnut was not a common, material back in 2009 when I started this project. I got the drum by 2010. So when we went walnut, I said, let's just do tongue oil on it. Let's do it really nice. Make it look like a classy Slingerland Radio King snare drum. Now, my only thing then was I wanted die-cast hoops. And by the way, he gave me die-cast hoops for this drum. The problem with the die-cast hoops was it seemed to choke this drum in a way I didn't like it as much. So those die-cast hoops have ended up on my acrylite, believe it or not. I did design the drum with 8 lugs. I wanted 8 lugs on it. I wanted old Radio King style. They didn't make drums with 10 lugs back in the 30s. 8 lugs was enough. So we went 8 lugs. I put a straight edge hoop on it about 5, 7, 8 years ago, somewhere in there. Maybe 5 years ago. And I had him put on, again, the Dunnett throw off. This is the Dunnett R1. Now, the cool thing about the Dunnett throws is you can loosen it and pull this off, and you can actually take the strainer off. And then pull the whole thing off, put the head back on, and then push it back on, and it's back in tune to where it was. I love this throw off. So, straight edge hoops seems to be the bomb for this drum, and this drum with straight edge hoops is just opened up in a way I can't explain. So the 2 snare drums that I got from Dan at DMR Drums is the cast aluminum 6.5 by 14 and this 7 by 14 solid walnut snare drum. And this one is supposed to be like a Radio King. And this was to replace the snare drum that I got from my friend Scott, the Noble Cooley, the 7 by 14. So I wanted something that was in that ballpark. So anyhow, Dan, this is 2010. I did this Big Beat event in 2010 with Dan and a bunch of his other DMR drummers. There was a couple guys in town that played DMR drums. And we did this Big Beat event, and that Christmas he gave me this little plaque. It said, Presenter Earl Bennett, DMR Custom Drums, thanks for being for a great year. Your banging is our passion. So this was like my artist gift that year, If I endorsed anything, I guess you would say it was DMR Custom Drums for a season. He also gave me a beautiful 4x14 piccolo snare drum that I've given to a friend of mine who's a jazz drummer. It's a white pearlescent paint. It's a beautiful drum. And he just loved it so much, I decided, here, take it, Alan. So I gave it to my friend Alan Levine. So he has that snare drum. But I wasn't playing it a lot. But I don't know. It's a cool drum. So I've had 3 DMR snare drums. Now, I will say one other thing. At the same time I got this walnut snare drum, I almost bought a walnut kit from Vaughn Craft Percussion. Not from them, but to have Dan build me the shells. He was going to buy the shells from Vaughn Craft and build me a drum kit, an endorser kit. But that didn't happen that year because my daughter got married. And that kind of changed the spectrum of my finances in a way that I couldn't really spend that kind of money on a drum kit. So I never really had an endorser kit. I did play some DMR drums for a drum clinic in 2009 for Drummers for Jesus, the Daytona Beach chapter. That was kind of fun. I'm not going to show you the pictures of that. That was probably me at my heaviest and worst at the point in pictures. But I will say this. If I have a picture of the drum kit, I'll post that up there for you. But Dan's style was the paint. Dan's style was to paint motorcycles and cars and race cars and stuff. He's that kind of a painter. And at one point, I was hoping he was going to paint those, pearl fiberglass drums. So maybe if he sees this and he tells me he's still around doing painting, who knows? Maybe I'll send those shells to him someday. That'd be kind of fun to get that kit one color, But yeah, I had some good times with Dan. I had a lot of fun with Dan, and was a great friend. He lives up in the Jacksonville area, so I don't see him very much. It's been a few years, but anyhow, Just wanted y'all to know that about these two snare drums. They are excellent snare drums. They're just custom drums. So anyhow, thanks for watching, and you all have a great day.